Thank you, Thomas. Does anyone know the guy he described? Because I don't know. Thanks, Thomas. And particularly thanks to the organising committee and Fabio, who's a stalwart of progress in the meat science world. Again, like our previous speaker, Keith, when I was given the title of this talk, I said this must be for a social scientist or not a meat scientist. But then I just took the end bit. Are we losing the trust of the consumers? And I focus in particularly on that end, because I think we have huge challenges as a cohort of people in the meat chain or as members of the meat stakeholders. So it is really up to everyone in this room to ensure that we protect the industry, protect the science, protect the integrity. So really that's what this talk is about. Keith again has alluded to one or 2 points I was going to make, so I'll skip over those fairly quickly. And just a very quick background is, yes, one of my roles at the moment is really getting value from public funded research in meat that'll make impact socially, economically, and with the industry. So in other words, certainly in Europe, but I know in America, Uruguay, all over the world, most research is funded from public money, taxpayers' money. And as you know, given the financial downturn we've experienced, there's a lot more asking questions as to the value of that money. The value of that science and the research and the outputs from the research are really being examined much more closely now to see what impact they'll make. Certainly, without compromising the science, we must continue to publish in high quality, peer-reviewed international journals, absolutely. But we also must go beyond that. We must actually see that the results or the conclusions can't always be more research needed. If you look at an awful lot of papers, more research is, maybe more research will be needed, but will companies come and fund that research? And they'll only fund it if they see market opportunities and growth opportunities. And who gives them growth opportunities and market opportunities but our consumer? Because they are the paymasters of business. So that's where there's quite a big link of a public body such as Teagasc, the Irish Agriculture and Food Development Agency, and the actual consumer. Because what we spend, we must make some impact. Now, I'm very pro-meat, obviously. I'm very pro-industry. But the first few slides I want to show are actually quite frightening and alarming. More so because I don't think there's any other, not only sector, but actually even a sector of the food industry that is subjected to these slides that I'm going to show. But as I say, and was mentioned in the previous talk, we must be much more transparent, we must be open, and we actually must call it as it is. Otherwise, we'll be in trouble with our end masters, which are the consumers. So, we all know about what happened just over a year ago about the fraud in horse meat and the adulteration. And, you know, I mean, there's big investigations into that. There were questions, certainly on the ethical use of the commodity. There was questions on the scientific integrity of the system, not only in the testing for the DNA, but also even on the testing of the food supply chain. But also, we have to step back and say there are actually criminals involved. There were people in the industry that are no different than muggers or robbers. They're actually criminals. And that's why we have to be really careful that the chain is protected. I mean, even this 99% horse, the methodology behind the testing of that was based more on DNA than on meat content. And again, they did want to know about its 30% of mitochondrial DNA. in a ratio of a standard. No, just the 33% will do. So therefore, there was 33% horse meat in burgers. And as you know, what happened there was the Irish Food Safety Authority test our products. And I'll come back to why we test our products so strenuously. It's mainly because we export 90% of what we produce. When you export, you're really up against very high, stringent standards. And therefore, we test everything. We tested our fish for origin and species. We test our other meat products. But one of the tests we did was on beef. And that's where it was discovered. It then turned out to be certainly a European issue. It was found all over Europe. It was found in Poland, in Holland, in France, in the UK. And it wasn't just our problem. It was the whole system. In fact, I was called in by the minister to at least contribute a bit of scientific thinking behind what the issue was. And I was absolutely shocked at the potential suppliers into one beef burger. I think there were over 140 global suppliers of ingredients into one beef burger, which really resulted in the conclusion that apart from criminals being involved, the whole meat chain is way too complex. The actual supply chain is so complex, people are sitting at computers, buying ingredients, not even seeing them, don't even know what they are, but they're boxes heading into different factories and different manufacturers. So that's just one. We know about, and I know Lo is in the audience, the donkey issue in South Africa. So that's Europe and Africa. We know about the pink slime. And again, the pink slime in itself wasn't fraud. The pink slime, and I'll come back to this in a bit more detail, was more a consumer attitude approach and a conclusion that there was some degree of, put it say, non-transparent actions or not on the label. But scientifically, the slime is an extract of beef trimmings extracted through centrifugation and ammonia. But nonetheless, that's not the point. The point I'm making here is that there was a massive consumer reaction because this told a really nice story of what they interpreted as being malpractice in the meat industry. We know about the, only recently, the Chinese scare of old meat that was detected in numerous multi-international chain of outlets in China. And this again has caused massive distrust and rebellion almost against the meat industry and the suppliers to these companies. And there's a lot of reeling still about this because we're dealing with a massive market. Unlike in Ireland, when the Chinese do find the culprits, they're liable to long imprisonment or even worse, as what happened in their dairy industry. But again, the lack of enforcement in Europe, in Africa, in China, and that's another case of poultry high levels of residue in China, which KFC are reeling about. There was a recent report by the XL Foods on high levels of E. coli. And this is only in the last year or so. Then there's the ongoing and persistent attack on the meat industry and this type of headline on cancer. And I must say, certainly the Americans in the National Cattlemen's Association really answered a lot of the arguments in this case. But nonetheless, this is the type of heading. We already know about the E. coli issues. We also know about the obesity then. When you talk about obesity in children, chances are it's a beef burger you'll see, the fast food outlet. Maybe a bit of milkshake as well, but a lot of focus, again, is on the meat industry. We know about the animal welfare from start to finish and how sensitive that can be, again, within the meat industry. We also know about the sustainability of the industry and the attack on the industry in terms of beef production and the use of high inputs and high emissions, say. So again, so the question is, with all of those factors going on, not in our heads, but in a normal consumer head globally, can the industry be trusted when you see all of this? Now, we'll come back to whether they can or not, but at this stage, I'd say someone better phone a friend quickly because there's so many questions there. And as I said, I don't think any other sector, certainly not in the food sector, but even the pharmaceutical, aeronautics, ICT industries would be subjected to such ongoing malpractices stroke bad publicity. And we should sit back a bit and ask, why is this the case? So the overview of the talk I am proceeding to give is really hitting a number of these points. Sort of looking at some aspects of the problem. Given that I'm not a social scientist, I'm really giving my experience where I see some of the issues within the industry and its interface, particularly with the consumer. I'll just talk about some of the structural issues in the industry, trust itself, who's communicating to who, some particular issues of concern to the consumers, particular concerns and examples of how they can be overcome or at least should be addressed, and a couple of conclusions. But I just have a quote there that the best way of finding out if you can trust someone is actually to trust someone. And then you soon find out. And that's what actually a lot of consumers have been doing. They've been trusting the meat supply chain to deliver nutritious, safe, wholesome product. But as soon as that trust dips, it's really difficult to win back that trust. So one of the problems, and I alluded to already, is actually the structure of the industry. As I mentioned, it's a complex structure even nationally. Within countries, it's quite complex. From the small farms and then the movement of cattle and the inputs into those cattle, right through to the either the feedlots or to the larger farmers and the finishing of those cattle, right through to the meat processing companies where they break down the meat. So I'm not sure whether we have that right, or at least is it being monitored correctly. So that's one issue. There's other issues as well. The nature of the beast. And what I mean by the beast isn't the cattle, is actually the industry. The industry itself has always been commodity-based. If you go back 50 years or more, it's very much about price-led, and little about certainly innovation, little about ethics, little about sustainability. So, I mean, there's a lot of people in the industry, and again, I'm speaking globally, that really don't value as much as maybe they ought to some of the issues that need to be considered and taken care of. Often price dictates an awful lot, hence the horse meat scandal. That was purely based on a price issue. It was cheaper to supplement beef burgers with horse meat. And in fact, in the analysis of that incident, the pressure was very much put on by the retailers. There's massive pressure by the retailers, the big global retailers, to say to the suppliers, produce a beef burger for 30 cents. And despite the fact that this is almost impossible, they do their best. And sometimes, especially at management, at the local plants, we can get malpractice. I mentioned criminals, and again, it's not mentioned too much because it's not a nice thing to mention. But where people do commit fraud for gain, by any definition, it's a criminal, and therefore needs to be taken care of in terms of arrest or whatever. Now, also the other issue with the industry is that the consumer, you can see, I'm not sure you can see it on this screen, but the last blue box right at the end says consumer. So what that tells us is that the consumer is way off the, way down the track in terms of its position in the chain. Unlike, say, the airline industry, where we can book our flights, and Howell Catlett would go into more detail on this, you book your flights, you act as an airline manager or person as a worker, because you print your ticket, you do almost everything with your iPhone, and you get on the plane. So you have a direct contact with the airline. When you buy beef, are you dealing with the suppliers of that market that may be in a different continent, and do you know even what's happened in between? So that's what I'm trying to make the point there. Oh, sorry. Is that my phone? Sorry about that. Yeah, that was my friend, Frona. He must have a question for me. But anyway, sorry about that. So there's little communication between the industry directly and the consumer. And important in this is that often the information that then travels up to the consumer is not only confused, but as I showed hopefully in the first few slides, is actually emotional. It's not black and white. It's, as Howell mentioned, the happy pigs and the happy cows. So really it gets a bit difficult to actually be objective in this communication. And again, I don't see anything around that's addressing this type of issue. Education. Now again, I mentioned the pharmaceutical, ICT, aeronautics industry. And if you were to take a dipstick and just get how well educated those industries are, by and large, they are quite educated. And I mean that in not just on pure qualifications, but I mean on regulations, compliance with safety systems, with quality systems, because they have to be. You can't go up in an aeroplane unless every single thing is checked. Equally, you can't take a drug unless it's gone through various clinical trials and that. So when it comes to the meat industry, even unlike the dairy industry, there are issues there on education. And again, I'm speaking directly to many meat companies. It's not a reflection on the companies themselves. It's part of the legacy. A lot of them can be family-run companies and very much based on what was always done. And most of all, what then is claimed as not only being in a product, but also where the product has come from, the history, the empathy, the provenance of the product is difficult to measure in most cases. But nonetheless, it's really important that the scientists must be close around that table. And again, and I haven't done this survey, it's something maybe for our society or whatever, but is how many scientists are employed by the meat industry? How many scientists? And I'm not really talking about quality control scientists. I'm more talking about rather technicians. I'm really talking about PhD level scientists compared with the value of the industry. And that ratio would be worth thinking about. I know in Ireland we are developing now PhD programs with the industry, and we can see some of them heading into the industry. So again, it's not a reflection, it's more a comment that that area is something that could be reflected on. Now, what is trust? Having said all of that, trust is a firm belief, and this is the Oxford or the Webster Dictionary, is a firm belief in the integrity, ability, and genuineness of meat, of a product of meat. And therefore, you're really putting that trust in with the consumer, that they believe that you will deliver integrity, effectiveness, and it's genuine. Trust isn't just confidence. You know, I've confidence that Keith and Lowell will deliver a good speech. Would I trust them to do it? It's not an issue, because it's not a risk. You trust people where there's a risk. I trust the pilot when he's driving the aeroplane. So trust is much more serious than being confident. Confident is a softer issue. Trust is really, you don't know, and you're putting everything in the place of someone, such as a pilot of an aeroplane or whatever. So that's why it's really important that trust is guarded and highly valued. And in fact, it's the most expensive thing in the world, is trust. But while it may take years to build up, and any brand managers here would say that, it can be gone in seconds. And even in the case of the horse meat incident, that factory actually closed overnight and eventually reopened under a different company completely. So trust is something that you can lose very quickly. So that's why it has to be valued. So I just have a couple of slides then from a study that was done fairly recently, last year in fact, from a European project called Food Risk. It's headed up by Professor Patrick Wall in UCD. And they just were pretty much thinking of the European Food Safety Authority's viewpoint on trust. In other words, who can the food industry depend on? And I just want to pick out a couple of things here. The food chain. The average in the EU is 45% of consumers trust the food chain. But in the likes of Germany, only 31%. So that to me is pretty low. And we heard earlier some of the figures from the US. Trust in regulators are higher, and trust in informers. Informers don't mean anything sinister. Informers are independent scientists, GPs, authorities. And then trust in, scientists like ourselves then is the highest. So that's why even just that table alone, from a meat industry perspective, should say, well really, when I talk about meat processing and the quality and efficacy of my product, I'm going to get the scientists to speak, not the, and dare I say it, the marketing manager or the CEO. Get the scientists to do it, because that's their training. When we break that down into more detailed analysis, it even gets more frightening. In the EU, only 38% trust food manufacturers. So in other words, even despite the European food safety standards and despite the regulations which, compared with international benchmarking, is quite high in Europe, still consumers do not trust the food industry or manufacturers. And they actually trust supermarkets even less. So national governments, they don't trust, well, 52%, and European institutes and like the Parliament and groups around the Parliament, and then food safety authorities or the European food safety authorities is quite high. Then when we break down the informers, as I mentioned, who do they trust most? And you can see there, it's the health professionals, the GPs, the nutritionists, the clinicians, the physicians. They also trust family and friends quite high, whether that's good or bad, but anyway, that's why I was phoning a friend there. So they trust family and friends, which means it works in the opposite. If someone, a family or friend, tells you a story of mistrust in the industry, it'll go back and action. There will be a consequence. I see time is that going down or up? Down. I'm not going to talk about the US figures. It was mentioned by Keith as well. But the one thing I would mention is food manufacturers, again, is even lower in the US. And in fact, just going back a bit, it's only 30% on agricultural production workers, i.e. Farms and producers. So it's quite low globally. Even in Germany, there must be a particular issue, which I didn't go into, and maybe someone here can explain. But there is a challenge at trust, and this is a magazine published this year, and it emphasizes that how can the German food industry win back trust. A chapter in that book was about Ireland, but in terms of its banking system, because of the downfall of the banks. But in Germany, the topic was the food industry. And the comment by the social scientist there is quite pertinent, because it says they will gain it back if they actively do what they have avoided to do, like the plague, and engage in open, transparent dialogue with opinion leaders, consumers, and media. And I think that says an awful lot across the chain, because a lot of the manufacturers hide behind the retailers and don't really come out in what we call peacetime, i.e. when there's no crisis. So who's communicating to who? And again, you can see it's a complex chain of landowners, farmers, processors, manufacturers, retailers, consumers, NCOs, agencies, and ourselves, scientists. But I get frightened when I talk to the meat industry, because often I say to them, let's talk about our next topic, which is research priorities, market opportunities with the meat industry. And wouldn't it be great if we brought in the retailers to input into that? And many of them say, no, leave the retailers outside, because they're afraid of the retailers grabbing a new idea and then putting pressure on the manufacturers to deliver. And that means, the breakdown of communication. Again, is something that's close to my heart, is the number of scientists, research scientists employed by the retailers, the major global retailers. And most of these guys that they do employ are based on their commodity buying. They buy the beef, they buy the tomatoes, they buy the seafood. But really, are they independent, and do they understand what makes a good steak or a good food product? And again, I often find they have a different priority. And again, dialogue between the manufacturers, the research scientists, universities and institutes, and the retailers, I think is something that is lacking around the industry and that we could benefit from. People say, well, that's all very well, but why are you so bothered about all of this? Because, well, one of the reasons is Ireland exports to an awful lot of countries. It's a population of just over 4 million people, but it actually exports, as I said, 80 to 90% of what we produce. It has major ambitious targets for growth. And you can see the top line there, that we're almost more than doubling our food exports over the 10-year period, And this is because we feel we've a good product, we've a good story to tell, and given everything I mentioned before, we certainly are not perfect, but at least we are addressing it. And I just want to, also the importance of the industry, I won't go into that. It does imply an awful lot. We're the largest beef exporter in Europe. We produce 15% of the world baby powder, infant milk formula, which has put that industry skyrocketing, especially from the Chinese issues. I won't go into details there. But one thing that we have done is we have developed a strategy, and it's on the web, called Food Harvest. It's not only an economic plan, it actually has with it a research plan, a strategic plan. So what we've done is that we've engaged government, producers, processors, customers, and all the agencies and researchers to try and deliver on the world markets and locally what consumers want. And that's the plan that is producing a lot, or informing a lot of our research projects, and I would say, and most people in Ireland would say, is why our exports are actually increasing, because of the integrated nature of our food industry. You know, for instance, all the main food producers in Ireland would regularly interact with the research community, both at PhD level, collaborative research, and contract research level as well. So we have this plan. It's monitored on a 3-monthly basis by our minister, so it's not a plan on a shelf, and it's being worked on constantly. So I won't go into too much detail. I think what I've said now emphasizes the need why we should communicate. Mainly for a balanced judgment, a transparent, based on transparency and on science evidence. So that's critical in the industry. One issue that's come up, though, is the manner of communication. And the manners of communication are taking me over, anyway, let alone the meat industry over, in terms of the form of communication. And I think Lowell Catlett alluded to that perfectly, that there's an awful lot of technology that's ready to burst onto the scene. So it's very much about sharing information, and it should be open discussion. It's, you can change beliefs and things, again, by communicating. And to emphasize the pros and the cons equally. And also, in terms, hopefully from an industry point of view, that there's a changed behavior, that the consumer will do something different. But even from a research community, it's important that the industry do things differently based on our communication. So EFSA, which very much is geared with protecting the European consumer, has guidelines and has issued guidelines in communication. And there's no reason whatsoever that these guidelines can't be embodied into the meat industry. Yes, they do deal with high-risk situations where drugs, antibiotics are used, or there's a claim for functional food. But nonetheless, if you look at the mechanism and the parameters of the engagement, it's something that we could examine. So the principles of any food risk stroke food benefit are openness, transparency, independence, and that's really important, and that's why I'm emphasizing, I think we have a big role to play in that, and responsiveness, timeliness, that it's responded to immediately. And that, what does that all mean? Well, what it actually means is that there's documents available, that there's communications in place, that there's timely communications, that there's a dialogue on the benefits, and that it's assessed by the managers. And what we're emphasizing there is there's no point talking to the researcher in the R&D department of a company or the quality control manager. This needs to be spoken to at the CEO level, right at the top, where the buck stops. And that we should acknowledge and communicate uncertainty. As we all know, scientists don't even have the answers. We heard Lowell mentioning he doesn't have the answers. So we should be saying this. There's nothing to hide about that. But again, it's not often done enough. So that book I mentioned, or that strategy of the European Food Safety Authority, is available. And if you look at it, but don't read it as a pure risk-based, a hazard stroke risk-based communication protocol, read it as any claim, low fat, gluten-free, tenderness, whatever. That's, if we're communicating that message, we should be able to use that protocol, and I think it would be well worth examining. So we know all the channels, and they're getting much more complex. The one thing I would say is they're getting faster. So if anything goes wrong, it can go wrong really quickly in terms of action. So there's consumer perception of the risk and the benefits, and there's the meat industry stakeholders' understanding of those perceptions. What I'd like to say, and I've shown this in a different way a couple of times, is that we're all one happy family, and that the perceptions are based on science evidence, and that the industry understanding is also based on science evidence. So there's that wheel that should be in motion rather than a linear line. And I think that would answer an awful lot of some of the few slides I showed at the start. The other thing to note is that consumers are different. We're not talking about a pea in a pod. We're not talking about an iPhone. We're talking about consumers. Some prefer providence, local markets, price-based, indulgence. We know all of that. So I'm just throwing that there to say it's not as simple as we're not dealing with widgets. One thing has come up is personalizing a story. The more we can, that example of the Japanese information and very few consumers using it, I reckon is because there isn't a story in it. If it may be said, and today the farmer who has 3 sons, and if there was a story there, you may find, and this is what our marketing agency is finding, they need more stories and activity. Food consumption is so important. It affects budgets, it connects, it's given more people a purpose. People are cooking more because of the recession, and also its role in health. So in fact, it's a huge opportunity. Now, I'm not going to go into details with all of this, but from a science point of view, we know exactly what the consumer wants in meat, and it's based on that. Going back to our EFSA document, do we have key documents? Are they understandable? Is there timely communications, dialogue, etc.? If we are communicating messages of safety, nutrition, sustainability, authenticity, and ethics. So that's what I'm connecting, that we can't just put it on a label, bless ourselves, and hope no one will ask the question. We need the background, and it's the science community that should be inputting quite a bit into those documents. So I have 1 minute 44 seconds left, but I just want to show you a couple of things on sustainability. It's not far away, and in fact in Ireland we are going to claim by 2016 that all our food produced, at least at farm level, is based on scientific metrics of sustainability. I won't go into detail, but if anyone wants to log into boardbia.ie, they can listen to the story of how we're emphasizing that need. We haven't got all the answers yet, especially as it goes up to the consumer. They're measured based on GPS systems and inputs, and what input the grass that we take a photo of. Not too unlike what the first speaker mentioned, but not quite there yet. US, we heard the growth in natural products. One thing I want to bear out on the US systems that are really being developing is this, that they have brought the consumer again on board. That again, a lot of sustainability systems are based on producer to retailer, and then the consumer buys it. There needs to be more engagement of the consumer, not only in appreciation, but even their own way of life in terms of sustainability. And what I mean by there is packaging, wastage, etc. So it's holistic. I won't go on, I have 16 seconds and counting. But I had a few stories to tell. But one of them is, this shocked me, and the American friends may know this pretty well. I mentioned the pink slime. that was out there, and it was a big discussion. I was actually in the factory, and as I said, it wasn't a safety issue. It was a consumer perception that this should not be used in whole ground beef products, because it's a bit more than ground. It's finely ground, whatever we call it. But word got around on either, not YouTube, what you call it, Facebook or Twitter, shows you I'm not too familiar with it, that's what McDonald's make nuggets with, this pink slime. And McDonald's, to its credit, decided to absolutely shoot that down. And the way it shot it down, it was McDonald's in Canada. They went and made a video of how a McNugget is actually made. And it's a fascinating video based in Cargill. And I'm not showing the video here, I'm only showing snapshots of it. But they go into absolute detail, not very appetizing. If you're a meat scientist, you know what minced meat or ground meat looks like, and sausage meat and casing. If you're a consumer, you say, whoops. But it went through the whole process of what was involved. Whole chicken breasts ground with a bit of chicken skin, couple of binders, lightly fried, and then packed. But that put the story to bed, and that was released in February 2014. But that's the example that they had a choice. Say nothing and watch the nuggets on Twitter do its damnedest, or shoot it in the butt and leave it up there for everyone to see. And that's what you call transparency. So other issues that we have to be careful of, and I'm finishing now, is health effects. We have to be very careful on health effects. It's easy to claim things, either positively and risk-based ones like the cancer link, processed meats, but equally like the omega-3 positive stories. Whether you talk about cancer or you talk about beneficial fatty acids, in my mind it makes no difference once you have your science-based facts, and that's the commonality between a risk and a benefit, and that needs to be addressed. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think there's huge opportunities in the meat industry. This is our local butchers, well, local in that they have a few butcher shops, and I know Rod Polkenhorn isn't here, but if he was, he'd be delighted to see what's happening here. You go into this butcher shop, you barely see housewives, you rarely see old men like myself. You see these bodybuilding young lads that are playing sport, and they are delving into lean chicken meat, lean steaks, lean mince, turkey mince, you name it. And it's almost now, that's where I do my shopping to get onto the team, etc. And they've found a really good market, at least locally. So in other words, they're selling high quality protein. And again, a message that's not sent around too often. So with that, I'm not going to go into, so this is the conclusion. Be honest, be transparent, measure. I think that was mentioned earlier, and it's the gap missing between the widgets that our first speaker spoke about and what we have today. We don't have those measurements because of the complex nature of meat, but hopefully they're on the way. Whistleblow, where you see things that shouldn't be happening, it's much better to put your hand up and say this is wrong. Communicate within the meat chain and put consumers at the center. So, are consumers losing trust? Not yet fully, but action needed. So, sorry about the time.
Thank you, Declan.